So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making to this panel. This is the 9th panel of part of the ongoing film festival called Odyssey, a Chinese cinema season, presented by UK-China Film Collab. It finishes on the 10th of June. Apart from the film program, we have been also organizing industry-focused panels to talk about some cutting-edge topics and debate related to film collaboration between the UK and Greater China. My name is Human Chan. I'm the founder and director of UK-China Film Collab. And today's panel is on the topic of British press coverages on Chinese films in the UK. And we're very pleased to have our speaker today, Martha Harwood, to join us. So Martha was selected to join our organization's Future Talent Program between 2021 and 2022. So the topic is also one of her projects. It's her project as part of the Future Talent Program, which is an investigation into the British press's coverages on Chinese films in recent years. And currently, Martha is also a university student studying French and Chinese studies at Lancashire University, and she's going into her 4th year for the program. And she just came back from Corsica for a year abroad for the French studies part. So, and I think Martha in today's panel will be sharing some of her findings, the latest findings. And also in the end of her Future Talent Program project with us, she'll be publishing a report which will include all her findings, analysis, and also recommendations. So I'm now going to pass the stage to Martha.
Thank you very much, Human, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm just going to share my screen now so you can see my presentation. Can somebody confirm that they can see the presentation so I know it's working?
Yeah, this is it.
Yep.
So as we've just said, I'll be talking about the current press coverages of Chinese language films in the UK. The structure of the discussion will be as follows. So I'll first present my findings and discuss a bit about what I've observed. Then following this, I'll be having a brief discussion with Dr. Gucce, Junior of Lancaster University. And then after this, hopefully there'll be time for questions and discussion involving everybody. As Human has mentioned, I'm a university student at Lancaster. And I joined the UCFC Future Talent Program in 2021 as the Journalism and Communication Specialist. My project with the UCFC has been researching and writing my report on current press coverages of Chinese film in the UK. I've also been conducting interviews and writing articles for the UCFC website, which you can see under the Insights tab on the website. So before I present my findings, I wanted to give you all a little bit of background. My hypothesis was that Chinese film is neglected in UK press. I found this report that was completed by a BBC journalist named Daniel Griffiths in 2013. And he found that in these 3 news outlets, the BBC, New York Times, and The Economist, 53% of all coverage related to China was related to economics and politics. And I quote, "issues reflective of a broader agenda such as society and social change, culture, or science and technology receive minimal coverage." So this broader agenda includes film, and that is only part of this 17%. So as we can see from this report, already Chinese film is not very visible in Western press. So my research was to extend this and investigate in more depth the presentation of Chinese films in UK journalism. So I started limiting my research by looking at the top 10 Chinese language films of each year according to calendar grosses in China. And calendar grosses means the films that made the most money in one year. So these were the highest earning films in China, in the Chinese language. So I didn't look at the films like the Hollywood films or the British films if they were doing well in China, because we know that they're being covered in British press. I then looked at how many of these films were released in the UK. And then after this, I looked into the journalistic coverage of the films in the following sources: The Guardian, Independent, Financial Times, The Times, and the BBC website's written articles. I chose these sources because I wanted a mix of outlets that were popular, that have an extended reach, as well as an online presence, and also resources that have a cultural influence. So papers like The Guardian and Financial Times are known for their coverage of films. Then after this, I had a look at the language that is used to discuss Chinese films and what this might tell us about the way journalism treats China as a whole. My findings that I'm presenting today will be for the years between 2017 and 2021, so the past 5 years. Just to start, this was the number of films that were released in the UK by years, out of the top 10 films for each year. And I wanted to show this because it shows that there is not much correlation between the number of films that are released in the UK and how much these films are written about. So in 2019, 10 of the top 10 Chinese language films were released in the UK. But in 2019, the coverage of Chinese film was not much higher than the previous year. And I just thought it was quite important to note that, 31 of these films were released in the UK, so 31 out of 50, which it was better than I was expecting, but still not that many. The number of articles by year, here I've divided it between full articles, so these are the articles that covered the film in question and nothing else. The focus of the article is just the film. And then the mentions are articles that included the name of the film or discussed the film in the context of something else. So the best year here was 2017. There were 8 full articles and 35 mentions. But as we'll see later, this is partly due to the fact this is the year where Wolf Warrior 2 was released. So this is a very big film and there was a lot of coverage for this. The lowest year was 2020. There was only 4 full articles and 6 mentions. I think this is due to COVID for 2 reasons. Firstly, that the cinemas were closed and people weren't going to see films, so there was just less journalism in general covering films. But also I think the fact that COVID originated in China perhaps fed into this pre-existing anxiety surrounding China and maybe made Chinese films less appealing to Western audiences. But we can see that in 2021, the number of articles did start to increase again, which I think is a positive sign that we're not letting COVID completely damage our image of China. Regarding the news outlets, The Guardian was the news outlet that wrote the most about China. Over the 5 years, there were 23 full articles covering the films and 28 mentions of the films. Then the second best was The Independent, with 5 full articles and 28 mentions. So we can see the difference between The Guardian and The Independent is quite big, with 23 full articles compared to 5. Then the Financial Times only wrote 1 full article, but there was 42 mentions. So I think this is probably due to the fact that a lot of film writing in the Financial Times is industry-based news, and the focus is less on full pieces about individual films. So I do think that's positive in that there were 42 mentions of Chinese films. It shows that Chinese films are on the radar for the journalists at the Financial Times. Then the worst was the BBC, which surprised me. There were only 4 full articles, and 5 mentions. I think it's important to note that a lot of the cultural content for the BBC is transmitted via radio or TV. So I suppose this does affect the fact that there was the number of written articles on the website, but I do still think it's surprisingly low, considering that it's such a big news outlet and a source of information for so many people. Now, moving on to some observations regarding the language that is used. So the first article I've got here is for The Rescue, which was an action film. And this article is from The Guardian. The article describes the film as an advert and obviously rubber stamped. I've chosen this article because I think it demonstrates how the focus of a lot of journalism regarding Chinese film is on propaganda and censorship. So even though this article does praise the action sequences in the film, the criticism always comes back to the political element of propaganda and censorship. Similarly, with this article from The Guardian about Ip Man 4, the focus of the article was on the racial commentary, so the conflict between the protagonist who's Chinese and the antagonist who's American, and this binary between the West and China. Again, we see this with the articles about the Battle at Lake Changjin. In this article from The Times, the film is described as anti-US. And these articles from The Independent and BBC describe the film as propaganda. Again, I think these articles are feeding into this, this tension between America and China, and perhaps overemphasizing the political element of the film. I think it's important to be aware of this element that Chinese film is politicized, because although a lot of Chinese film is influenced by the politics of the country and the influence of the government, it's important that we don't make politics and culture indivisible, because it's becoming more and more difficult to praise Chinese films artistically, because we are learning to associate Chinese films with propaganda. One thing that I do want to note is the use of the word propaganda, especially. This is a difficult point because many of you may know, but in China, a big genre is zhu xuan lu, which means main melody film. And this is often translated as propaganda. And I think in English, the word propaganda has some very strong connotations and very emotional connotations that main melody film doesn't have in Chinese. So main melody films are films that are government backed, and they do often have a message that supports the Communist Party. But for a Chinese audience, this would not have such a negative connotation that it does in the UK. So perhaps part of the problem is about the lack of understanding about the different genres of Chinese film. But I think it's important to note that perhaps with the use of language, there is a difference between propaganda and main melody films, and the impact that these words have. There was also some fair points raised in the article, so some fair criticism. This article on the left is from the Financial Times, and it does discuss censorship and the political influence in Chinese films. But it is making the point that because of this political influence, Chinese films are quite difficult to market in the West, because the political undertones are often quite strong, and I think that this might be difficult for Western audiences to overcome. So this is making a fair point, because it is true. Then the second article is from The Guardian about the film Shockwave. And again is making a fair point about Chinese films, recent Chinese films, often relying on Hollywood tropes. So a lot of genre films that are coming from China are very sort of based on tropes and cliches that we are very used to seeing in Hollywood films. But for a Chinese audience, this is all quite new. So a quote from this article says that the film is fundamentally very old school and not necessarily in a good way, right down to the repeated shots of people running away from fireballs. So for a Western audience, an audience that's used to films like Mission Impossible, this is old, this is a bit stale. But for a Chinese audience that hasn't necessarily had the same films on their radar, this is something different. I also want to point out that not all articles were negative. So for example, this article from the Financial Times does praise the film Sheep Without a Shepherd for its artistic qualities and storytelling merits. But that being said, I do want to emphasize that a lot of the articles that I did see, even when they did praise the Chinese films, often came back to the political element. Now, here are some films that nobody was talking about. Out of the 50 top 10 films that I looked at, there were 17 that weren't discussed at all. And 5 of these were released in the UK. I'm not sure what the common factor is between them. For some films like My People, My Country and the other films in that trilogy, I can understand the why it wasn't covered, because these films are very patriotic Chinese films and they do refer to Chinese history that I suppose they're not intended for a Western audience. So I can understand why they weren't discussed as much or at all. But there are other films like Adoring, for example, which I've put the poster for here, which is it's a genre film. It's a romantic comedy, as you can tell from the poster. It's a romantic comedy about couples and their pets. And for this sort of film, I don't really understand why we might not be talking about them, because I think this sort of film is very appealing and it's very accessible. And it was released in the UK. So it surprises me that nobody mentioned it. Now, the most talked about films, I mentioned before, Wolf Warrior 2. It was released in 2017, and there were 5 full articles covering Wolf Warrior 2 and 22 mentions. And the second most talked about film was Battle at Lake Changjin, which had 4 full articles and 12 mentions. So what was being said about Wolf Warrior 2 and why was it so present in the British press? There are several reasons. Firstly, it's a very economically important film. So it earned more than $8.5 billion US at the 2017 box office, which was more than double the second highest grossing film of the year. And these earnings accounted for more than 10% of the total 2017 box office in China. And at the time was the highest grossing film ever, until it was overtaken in 2021 via the Battle at Lake Changjin. So it's a very economically important film. It's difficult to ignore a film that performs so well at the box office. The BBC does also note that it's a good film, even though it's sort of relying on a lot of the action tropes that I mentioned earlier. The action sequences are very impressive. It was a very high budget film, so that's why but one of the reasons it drew in such a large audience. However, these articles, as we can see, the first headline from the BBC and the second from the Times, I believe, the emphasis is on the political element again. It's a nationalist film, it's a flag waving film. So it's still being treated as sort of a propaganda film. But I did want to also draw attention to this headline from The Independent, because the article was quite a nuanced commentary on the film. And it notes that the film is a reflection of China's attitude to the rest of the world. One of the things that it mentioned that I didn't see mentioned in the other articles was the fact that the film discusses the impact of European colonialism in China and Africa. So the film is about China's relationship with Africa, China's solidarity with Africa in a post-colonial environment. And I think it's interesting that this element of the film wasn't mentioned in other articles, because it's quite an important point about the film that the film is discussing China's relationship with the rest of the world and how its history has affected this. The article also makes the comparison to Rambo, which is a comparison which is made before with the Wolf Warrior films. But in this article, it notes that Rambo is similarly a reflection of America's anxieties. So it was about America's struggles after the Vietnam War. And similarly, Wolf Warrior 2 is about China's struggles and its relationship with Africa because of colonialism. So the reason I wanted to highlight this article is because I think it places the film in its political context and discusses why it's important to see films like this in order to understand a situation in a country. So even though it might be, as the BBC notes, a nationalist film, it is also saying something very important about the country and about its relationship with other countries. And this article doesn't just politicize the film for the sake of critiquing it. It mentions the political aspects that are relevant for discussing its importance. Just to end, I wanted to talk about some of the reasons that perhaps why the discussion of Chinese film is the way it is. So part of the reason is the industry, being both the film industry and the journalism industry. First of all, there is the language barrier, and this does mean that Chinese films are less likely to be distributed in the UK because distribution companies aren't so keen on subtitled films. And there is also the cultural barrier, meaning that a lot of Chinese films do make reference to historical or cultural events that aren't so well known in the West. So these are some reasons that perhaps Chinese films aren't so present in UK press. Also, as we've seen before, the politics and censorship issue is quite a big one. The fact that Chinese films are subject often to political influence does mean that they are less appealing to Western audiences. But also something that was mentioned to me by Derek Hurd from Lancaster University is the issue of freedom of press. So the fact that China is a country where freedom of speech is limited in certain ways means that for Western journalists, it's almost seen as an attack on the industry of journalism, because the freedom of press and the freedom of speech in the UK is such a fundamental part of our identity that when we see a film that comes from a country that doesn't have that, it's almost like an attack on our identity. There is also a socio-historical influence playing a role here, which goes all the way back to the 16th century when the European Jesuits visited China. And this is arguably the beginning of the UK's relationship with China. But the problems sort of start more in the 19th century with the Opium Wars, because this meant that China was being treated as a colony, a European colony, and it was being treated as an undeveloped country. So a lot of Chinese culture was being compared to European culture, and according to the criteria of European culture, was not up to such a high standard. Then, in a rather contradictory manner, into the 19th and 20th century, we have China being presented in the UK press as a yellow peril, which is obviously a very racist term. But it was used because I think there was quite a bit of anxiety about China's growing power and its strength as an independent country. And both of these elements feed into the present day where China is othered. So on the one hand, China is seen as a sort of undeveloped country that is not up to the standards of European culture. But then on the other hand, we have China as a growing international player and a very strong economic force, almost a threat. So both of these things feed into the way China is talked about, and I think it means that nobody really knows how to talk about China. So the final question is, why is this important? I think that journalism does play a very important role in forming public opinion and influences film audiences in this case. So it's important that film journalism does cover Chinese film fairly, because it will impact the way that people see Chinese films and by extension the way they see China. It is also important for journalists as well as readers of journalism to reflect on how we think and talk about China. If the only journalism that we consume about China is strongly political, then in our minds China will only be a political entity, and the cultural products that come from it won't be seen as valuable when they are. Finally, where do we go from here? I think for everybody, it's important to read around. When we consume journalism, it's important not to take the word of one journalist or one article as the truth. It's important to read critically and compare what we read in journalism with what we experience in real life, and in this case, what we see in the films. Also, for everybody, I'd suggest looking at streaming services to look at Chinese films. One of the issues that I came across when I've been speaking to people for this report is journalists saying it's difficult to write about Chinese film because they're not being shown in cinemas. But my response to this would be, there's a lot of Chinese films on streaming services like Amazon or Netflix. So perhaps we should start writing about these films as well, because films are no longer limited to the cinema. And for everyone, yeah, it's good to have access to Chinese films on streaming services. I hope this has been interesting, and I'm looking forward to discussing this with everybody else. But now I'm going to invite Dr. Guche Jr. To join in. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much for being here. So I'll just introduce Dr. Guche. He is a scholar of journalism studies at Lancaster University and the author of several publications in academic journals, as well as the author of books about journalism and its political importance. So thank you very much for being here, Dr. Guche. I shall just stop sharing so people can see. My first question is about the title of one of your books, which is called Media Control, News as an Institution of Power and Social Control. I think this title highlights the power that journalism can hold over a society. And could you elaborate on how writing about films might be a form of social control?
Sure. Well, thanks. I mean, I think that thanks for having me. This is a really smart conversation that you're having, and I hope that people are engaging with it. In answering that question, I kind of the title of the book, Media Control, is kind of a double entendre to some degree. That when you look up in scholarship the term media control, if it's not Noam Chomsky's book that I kind of swiped a little bit for mine, but it would be people talking about issues of non-Western societies where they're saying that governments are controlling the content and the speech. And I'm not going to get into a debate about the degree to which some of that's happening. I'm more interested in kind of the imaginations and the power behind that and the manipulation of the way people interpret some of these non-Western places, and of course a place kind of like, again, the imagination of China is similar in that respect. I think one of the things to also kind of complicate, and I don't know if people can see the chat and if it's appropriate for me to do this, but I'm just going to put a couple things in here because what I think also is being talked about is what some scholars are calling, you say film journalism and yes, but also notions of cultural journalism. And these are just a couple articles from the last few years. Again, they're focused, I think, mostly in Nordic parts of the world, but sorry, can you hear me? Okay, the intersections between other types of, a bit between cultural stuff that's looking at dance and pop culture, music, film, and the other editorial components of how journalism operates. So, breaking news of violence or political upheaval or social contestation, or something that's happened within pop culture that's been adopted by harder news folk, but really is probably something that should be owned in more of a cultural set. But anyway, so just a couple articles I put into the chat, and a podcast I do, we talked about one of those articles and about the politicization of cultural journalism. So long story short, I very much subscribe to your interpretations of hows and whys of how journalists from the West are covering these things. I'm glad that you mentioned the streaming services. More and more, we're seeing cultural journalists writing about things that are streaming. That makes sense, not just because maybe that's what people are watching, but that's where audiences are going. At the end of the day, we have this notion of journalistic interpretive communities where there are boundaries, ideological boundaries around what can and can't be said within journalism without losing audiences, without losing journalistic authority and legitimacy. And it's unfortunate that, yes, these lenses are placed upon how people select what they want to write about or review and how they write and review it. And the kind of the two other quick things, sorry, because just really, really interesting to be listening to what you're talking about. One is it reminds me not just of how production houses change things based upon the political nature of things, and not to move away from China, but if we were to move to, I think, the 2012 film Red Dawn, which was a remake of when Soviets were parachuting into the United States to take over the United States, which was, a very popular sort of discourse, which fed on some of the moral panics and some of the realities of post-Cold War tensions. In 2012, because of some of those tensions with Russia, they swapped out the Russians for North Koreans, and because that was going to be seen as more popular among audiences. And then, of course, that feeds itself in its way into cultural journalism and other forms of journalism about those things. One thing I would like to see happen, kind of from what you're talking about, is better cultural journalism about Western nationalistic work, right? I mean, I think Marvel films are a pretty good indication when you have Iron Man working with the US military and other Western military, but audiences flock to that. We refuse to see that sort of propaganda exists. When in Black Panther, for instance, a hero at the end is a white male CIA agent who's diverting weapons. I mean, there's just this Kafkaesque sort of representation, and journalists from the West seem to, only use the term that you use, propaganda or notions of censorship, when it comes to places such as popular representations of China. I don't think I answered your questions specifically, but I think there's just a lot kind of rich within this work.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the way, in comparison, journalists write about American films. So do you think that there is sort of some double standards when it comes to the criteria?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these media systems operate not just upon the economic base, but the ideological basis, right? And that these things are directly connected with one another. and there's, I mean, there's even, you know, cases where in order to get some of these things filmed, right, you need permission from governments. If you want to do some, you know, if you want to use British warships, for instance, right, in a film that you're doing, you have to kind of abide by the rules surrounding that and get authority. One of the early and I'm sorry, most of my research is in the US, so I don't mean to be so ethnocentric, but I think that the practices representative across Western, global Northwestern sort of communities. But there was, there were TV shows like Emergency and Dragnet and these other things early on in TV, popular TV in the United States, where the producers based in LA talking about police and paramedics and firefighters, really elevating those types of careers and the ideologies and the Americanness and civicness behind those things, not only went into long monologues about the dangers of drugs and how marijuana was a gateway drug, could lead you to murder and suicide, and these you know, real far-reaching sort of things, again dealing with cultural trauma and moral panics, rooted in social control and order, right? Desires for social control and order, racist meanings of social control and order as well. Well, what we saw was that there were direct connections between the LA police chief's office, the police benevolent associations, right, and these unions, and the producers. And so essentially these scripts that were created, the shots that were taken, the scenes that were used, the narratives and overarching stories were endorsed and supported by the police departments, right? And so I think if we were even to go back to a really early kind of ethnographic piece, Hortus Powdermaker's piece in Hollywood, and I'm forgetting exactly what the name was, but we can look up the author. You'll see kind of some of the role over this production, and none of that stuff has changed. In fact, it's just gotten more and more caught up in one another. And these associations between the socio-political and geopolitical positions and tensions, which are also performances and manufactured in many cases, are not just reproduced in film, but are propagated through and by film. And I really find it unfortunate, as you showed, that there are lots of pieces of art and expression that aren't being showed, in part because it threatens those dominant perceptions that audiences might have.
So do you think perhaps that, well, whose role do you think it is to change this perception? Is it the journalists, or is it the audience, or is it just everyone in society needs to sort of?
I'm not good at solutions all the time, right? I mean, I think one of the issues with solutions is we first have to kind of come to some agreement about what the problem is. And I think there's so many complexities around the problems and disagreements about the problems. But I think, I don't really think the individual solution is the answer. If I do this, I don't want to take away anybody's individual notions of individual agency. But I think as long as we continue to flock to things like Marvel, and I'm not a Luddite, and I'm not saying that my kids don't have Marvel things, and I'm not saying my partner doesn't love Marvel, she does, like all this sort of stuff. But I think that as long as we continue to pay with our dollars in our social media engagements and all these different things, we won't be able to pull apart kind of the veins and the veils that are between them, right? I mean, I even remember walking out of, a film once, Abraham. I mean, I'm a white guy from the United States, so of course I'm going to go see a silly movie about Abraham Lincoln, right? But I walk out of the film, and in the parking lot, I say something like, "Where were all the Black people? Where were all the Black people?" And I must have said it too loud, even as an American, because some people turned around and gave this scowled, look on your face. How dare you say something critical about patriotism, nationalism? And I imagine that these types of ideas are happening surrounding the pieces that you're talking about, right? Or the ways that people would perceive them, or why is the Guardian, or why is the New York Times, or why is another news organization giving credence to a place that has an imagination as being an enemy to quote unquote democracy and quote unquote, freedom. And sorry, I also kind of take a little bit of issue with the statements around democracy in the UK and in England and free speech, which doesn't really exist here. But as we continue to perpetuate those ideas through popular culture, that is of an othering, right? It reinforces the idea that, nope, nothing to see here, no problems here, at least we're not there. And I don't think that that's a really good idea.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's perhaps the way we write about Chinese film is almost a defensive thing to try and detract from.
Or if it's not defensive, it's offensive, right? And it's a perpetuation, a reproduction of an ideology. So I very rarely think that we're defensive. I think that we have mechanisms in place that are so rooted that whether an event was going to happen or not that we must respond to, we were going to perpetuate something anyway, right? And it's a constant mechanism of a force going forward. So yeah, there might be moments of reaction, right? But that doesn't ignore, and I'm not suggesting you're suggesting this either, but it doesn't ignore that there's instead a big machine making its way, and it might, respond here or there, but it's designed to just continue to perpetuate that ideology.
Yeah, and it's almost paradoxical, like criticizing a film for being subject to censorship. In order to say don't go and see it because it's subject to censorship is in itself almost.
I mean, we published a piece, a doctoral student who's graduated. We published a piece recently about investigative journalists in Beijing, and some of and I help edit a journal, and whenever we have people coming in saying something that's counterintuitive to dominant, the scholarly elite, right? And here I also find, relatedly, I find students here when they're working on their theses or dissertations about parts of China, the Western folk around the table come back and say, well, what about censorship? What about censorship? And it's like even the scholars can't get out of kind of that paradigm to say, okay, yeah, maybe censorship, maybe state-run messaging, but that doesn't remove agency of the individual, and that doesn't mean that there isn't autonomy among journalists to be investigative. I mean, this was about investigative journalists, and the response we were getting is, how can there be investigative journalism in China? And it's like, well, go and talk to the people, read theirs. I mean, I can't read this stuff, so I'm relying on my colleague, right? Read their stuff, talk about it, go beyond things. And let's not forget, places like the BBC are state-run. It's not just Russian television. It's not just, NPR, National Public Radio in the United States, state-run, right? There are controls in place to keep things from going too far or one way or the other. And certainly that's, I think, even more so in Britain, which makes this kind of juxtaposition that you're talking about a little odd sometimes. I think one other thing, if we are interested in individual level solutions, which again, I'm not usually the one to advocate solely for that, are, when you see something on Netflix or you see something on Amazon, remember you're also, sharing data and doing exactly what Netflix wants you to do. And there's a capitalistic function behind this, but there's nothing, I don't think if you're advocating for a certain type of genre or from a certain geography, pushing that out there. And, sometimes I'm a fan of some forms of shaming, maybe shaming when people don't want to watch things with subtitles. I think, unless there are some other challenges, right, of that subtitles might create for an individual or community, I think, let's watch things in their original, let's hear things in their original manner, and try and be this inclusive as we say we want to be.
Yeah, I think it's in part taking some responsibility as a viewer of a film or as a reviewer of a film, that you do have to be critical about the things you see, but not sort of I don't know what not to an extent where it's just without reason, you know.
But nobody's critical of the Avengers. I don't mean to keep pounding this, you know, beating this in, but nobody's critical of the Avengers except for or Aquaman, unless they like Amber Heard or not, right? And they don't even know Amber Heard, right? They just are relying on popular culture. So, you know, maybe we also need to be more critical of the stuff that we continue to consume.
And it's like the articles about the new Top Gun film. I think people are becoming a bit more aware how sort of military propaganda the Top Gun films are.
Yep.
But even so, a lot of the journalism about the Top Gun film are saying, "Oh, we're going to see it anyway because it's fun," you know.
Yeah.
It's definitely a double standard. Yeah. Yeah, my sort of final question, I suppose, linked to this is, why do you believe journalists might feel more comfortable covering films that are overtly political, like, for example, Top Gun, from countries other than China? So, you know, there are films, socialist films or films that were made in the Soviet Union that are just as propagandistic as Chinese films, but they are still praised artistically. Why do you think that is the case?
Yeah. I mean, partially to answer that question, I think, you know, the Christina and others who are writing more about this in these links that I put in the chat are probably much more akin to, or, you know, akin to that sort of way. But I think that you know, a couple of things about journalism writ large, and I think this does include, and as Nate and others have written, are inclusive of cultural journalism. Is journalism is very Western journalism is very event and issue driven, right? So I think when we've seen that doesn't mean that sometimes, I mean, well, let's start there. So it's event driven. You know, what's going on that we can connect to again maintain some relevancy and legitimacy with our audiences and our subscribers and other people who are, you know, our advertisers and other institutions. So I think that's one thing. They're issue driven, right? So when they get it, I mean, having had been a reporter for a very long time, we get so much advance notice about things. I mean, the kit that comes in from a lot of these even independent film production, you know, spaces is really a well-oiled machine. Right. Certainly when you get to awards time, it's an even more well-oiled machine. And I think that it's easier, and I don't know that that's the best answer, but it's a path of least resistance, right? For a journalist who has alleged pressures upon themselves of time and other things. Some of those things are true, some of those things might be manufactured, where these things just kind of rise to the surface. I mean, if I was a book reviews editor for you know, BBC Radio or something like that, I'm sure you're getting a bunch of this stuff in the mail all the time. You're getting free access to all this material, and that just kind of stacks up on your desk or in your email, right? And then these other things become less. I think so. While it's event driven and issue driven, I think it's also sometimes predominantly, not that there aren't moments of difference, but predominantly also very interested in what you've been talking about, othering, right? And othering in one or two ways, othering with some sort of predisposed, you know, ideological purpose of why othering should be done to either subjugate, marginalize, you know, so on and so forth, or other as some sort of, you know, eating the other sort of idea, right? Some sort of faux celebration. It doesn't mean that all of this is, all that I'm talking about is the same and that's malicious and nefarious, right? But I'm talking kind of the top level stuff. So like when I see something on, you know, Guardian where they're reviewing a bunch of podcasts in Africa. Well, first of all, I'm kind of like, well, Africa's not one place, right? So what do you mean in Africa, right? And then you look through and there's specific geographic areas, of course, right? And I think that sometimes there's this desire of, well, people are going to be interested in something Africa, although we're not really going to explain or understand what Africa is and isn't. And so, you know, but maybe it's too hard or takes up too much time or doesn't work for SEO to list, you know, these different geographic areas that happen to be in a continent called Africa, right? So I think that there's kind of these different things of event-driven, issue-driven, and these multifaceted approaches to what the other can represent and mean. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who are good-spirited, right? You know, have the best hopes in mind. But I think that when you're trying to boil things down to an attention level, you're always trying to get into somebody's schema. You're always trying to get into that folder in the back of their head that says what's going to not just resonate with somebody like, oh, I recognize that, that makes sense, but what's going to be salient to them, what's going to say, oh yeah, this institution that's telling me about this thing has my interests at heart. They're like me. They're going to help me, and I need to continue that relationship with them. And so I think that not all journalists or psychologists or sociologists in the sense that they're trying to get to these things, but it's the culture, some of the culture that we're embedded to, and certainly some of the hierarchical influences of how journalism is produced. I don't know if that answered your question, but again, my mind is all over the place because I think what you're talking about is really, really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. No, thanks for your answers. They're really interesting. And thank you for being here.
Sure.
We have a bit of time left, so if there's anyone who wants to ask any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or just turn on your microphone and ask.
Hi, thank you both for a really interesting discussion, and I've been trying to think along with you about solutions. Is there anything, well, as a university student and Dr. Gutcher as a university lecturer, is there anything educationally that we can do at a pre-university level to try and get young people thinking more critically about the media that they feed on every day, and perhaps make it more equitable through education at a lower level? I mean, at a school level rather than higher education level.
Martha, it's your show, so I want you to go first. I know that was at both of us, but I think it'd be good for you to think about it.
Okay, yeah, I think it's important to treat journalism as a piece of media in the way that we treat, say, literary products or artistic products as a piece of media. So at school, we're taught to analyze pieces of literature or pieces of art critically, and I think it would be good to sort of introduce the same sort of practice for journalism, because I think, yeah, when you're at primary school, you're not really aware of journalism, and then all of a sudden you reach high school and everyone's reading about what's going on in the world, and you sort of join in, but without any guidance or any framework of how to read journalism critically. And I suppose you are taught that a bit at university, in that we're taught to sort of read everything critically and analyze what we read. But I think it's important to specifically think about this practice for journalistic writing. But, yeah.
And if, is it okay if sorry, I didn't, can I just give a 2-second sort of, yeah, I love the question. I think that I mean, when we're educators as individuals and as communities, it's really hard to be inclusive in all of the examples. I mean, I'm also, from a country where we're banning critical race theory, even in math books, where someone says, so-and-so from Honduras is selling, 3 cars to someone in, Alabama. And, the governments are coming back and saying, well, we don't want to recognize Honduras. So, because you're doing that to indoctrinate students to a global community. And it's more than that. They don't want it to be about, because if then we'll be talking about Blacks and US Blacks and African Americans, and that's not what the white power elite there wants. But I think even here, I tried to do a third year module where I was thinking, okay, maybe these students have already been exposed to something, so I can talk about parts of Latin America, my media examples of film and of music and of YouTube videos. even if they're dubbed in English, which I don't like to do, right? Or there's subtitles available, which I like to do. The students just didn't pay it any mind. It's almost like, I thought you wanted decolonization. I thought you wanted inclusivity. And this is at Lancaster, where we spend way too much time talking about these things. If it's not working, maybe we needed to just normalize it more than just trying to call it something else. That's a different conversation. But I found it really problematic because I'm like, well, there's a whole bunch of world in the global South, a term I don't necessarily like to adopt because it creates sort of a melting pot sort of thing that all of the North is the same and all the South is the same. But I think the more that we can prepare people with even one example of like, here, you know, we're talking about a YouTube video, and here it is about some sort of concept or idea, and here's an example of how it manifests itself in Chile, for instance, right? I mean, the more that those seeds can be put out there, I don't think that does anything but then help promote those differences later. That's a really silly solution, maybe. That's a really too simplistic solution. But I, for one, was really disappointed that, you know, they just didn't, maybe it's me, maybe I'm a bad teacher, maybe it was a bad module, it was COVID, I don't know. But I thought that there would be more desire for internationality in media representations. So I'm kind of lost. I'm sort of lost in the same question. I mean, can the person who asked, do you have solutions too? Because I think that could be really helpful.
No, I don't have solutions, but I've really enjoyed listening to both your answers. Thank you. And it has sparked an idea about cognitive dissonance, your description of you're trying to teach your module to students who are constantly talking about decolonizing their curriculum. And so that's given me more food for thought. Thank you, both of you. Yeah.
And thank you. There's a question in the chat that would like to, from Patrick Mulcahy, I think. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, of course. Hi everybody. I felt that I've jumped in ahead of Katie, so sorry, Katie.
That's okay.
All right, thank you. So I've been writing about films for a number of years, and I've been writing a blog for the last 8 years on female-directed films. And of course, one of the films that I really want to see, and I haven't been able to see, is Hi Mom, which was one of the highest grossing Chinese films of 2021. And essentially, it's a mother-daughter film with time travel in it that is, you know, it got a lot of popular attention, but is thematically similar to, in some ways, Petite Maman. But nevertheless, the issue that I have is in terms of coverage. So far, Martha, you've talked about articles that really talk about films as a cultural phenomenon. Why is Wolf Warrior 2 so successful? Why, or the 800, or whatever film it might be. And so it's very much looking at through that prism. But I guess film reviewers are like me. We're interested in the films itself and what qualities they have. So one of the Chinese films that I did write about was Love You Forever, which was in a banner year for 2020. And I noticed that Trinity Cine Asia are on this call, and I'd like to give them a shout out because they helped promote 3 films in 2020, The 800, Sheep Without a Shepherd, and Love You Forever. So, so I think that there is something to be said about how we discuss films in terms of not just as on the cultural phenomenal level, but hey, they're in cinemas. Let's have a review of them. So I know that Trinity Cine Asia have been trying to get us to review them, but we should also talk about editors. What are editors willing to accept, and how much space in print, at least, are they willing to give writers? Which I suspect is not a great deal in terms of, because they look at all of the films that are being released and say, well, what are people most likely to be interested in? But it's also worth remembering that Chinese cinema is a parallel cinema as far as it's consumed in the UK along with Polish cinema and Indian cinema. And there, there isn't that much coverage of those two national cinemas either. But essentially, yeah. So that's really my point about actually changing. Not your article, your thesis, Martha, should not just be about how people are writing about films as cultural phenomenon, but also about the access to films, the battle to get a film reviewed, and also a battle to see a film as well. Thank you very much. I'm glad there's an explosion of questions. Katie, next, please.
Oh, thank you for mentioning that, Patrick. If it's okay, I'd like to just respond to that quickly. It was good that you mentioned how many of the articles are sort of about the industry rather than about individual films. I think that's quite an important thing to note because, well, I guess it shows how journalists seem to be unwilling to give an opinion about a Chinese film. It's almost like they're trying to treat it as an academic subject, as, you know, putting it into an economic context rather than talking about it as an artistic product. And I guess that is in part due to the othering that is happening more widely. And yeah, journalists don't have the framework to write about Chinese films in the same way that they write about, say, European films, which have an established tradition of being artistically respected. So yeah, that's definitely something that I guess we need to change. And like you say, having people who are more willing to review Chinese films specifically. And the role of editors is also interesting. I know I've spoken to a couple of journalists while I've been doing this project, and they have said, you know, if they want to write about a Chinese film, even if they want to write about a Chinese film, they might present that to an editor, and the editor says that they don't want it in the paper because it's, you know, no one's going to be interested in it, or it's too political, you know. So you're right. I think as well as the individual journalists, I suppose the organizations of journalism as a whole do also need to reflect on their practices. Would Katie like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you for taking it, and thank you for hosting this panel. Just a little bit of information about me. I am a film reviewer. I've been reviewing films, both you know, English-based and Chinese-based, for a number of years. I've been so I know a lot about Sydney Asia's work as well. I just want to put down the perspective. It's not just about the willingness of the press as well. It's also about accessibility. Not many distribution companies are willing to promote Chinese language films. I'm not sure why, because I think as a film reviewer, it's important to have that kind of diversity, especially when Chinese language films are becoming more prominent in Western entertainment, like Crazy Rich Asians and Everything Everywhere All at Once. As now they're now capturing not just Chinese audiences but American audiences. But people need to remember Chinese is the part of the film's identity, and that should be acknowledged. However, it is kind of an uphill struggle, not just for like the Chinese industry on, you know, actors and stuff, but also the press, because I am British born Chinese, and I try and reflect that when I do in my criticism. It's not just from, I'm not just relating it from my identity. I'm not solely basing it on a political agenda or stuff. It's how I perceive. It's a matter of perception. I think people also need to understand that as well. So basis is that we need to have increased presence as well as accessibility. It's not just streaming services are very well stuff, but people need to remember, with the cost of living starting to become more constrained in the UK, they may not have that kind of access. So cinemas is just as important, but people need to be more open-minded to Chinese cinema. It's not just about, don't forget this about the subtitles, it's about the message and what you take from the film. That's the most important.
Yeah, thank you for saying that.
Can I chime in, Martha? I know we have another person or a couple other people. I don't mean to dominate the chat, but I just put a couple more resources in there, and I know they're all behind paywalls. So if there's anything that anybody's interested in, please send me an email and I put that into the chat, and we can work around those paywalls. The second thing is for those who do reviews or do cultural journalism who are interested and want to, maybe talk to some students, masters and undergraduate students. I know the students would love that. So I also put my email in there. I'm sorry, Martha, I don't mean to make this about me, but I love the idea of trying to spread that knowledge and engage with people who are doing some of these social and cultural practices.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's good to get people involved in. That's what I wanted this to be a discussion, and help people to reflect on journalism as a whole. So yeah, it's good. I just wanted to respond to Katie's point as well. I think you make a good point about distribution companies not being as willing to promote Chinese films. I think that it's all a bit of a vicious circle, because I think maybe in part that's also due to the way that Chinese films are written about, because once they're politicized in such a way, it means that distribution companies won't be wanting to promote a film that they see as political, and then there'll be less films being distributed, so less journalism being written about these films. So it's a difficult problem, and I'm not sure, well, like we said, I'm not sure what the solution is, but I guess it's about changing the general perspective and the general attitude towards China and its culture. Is there Bev Andrews? You've raised your hand. Would you like to speak?
I just want to say first, just a huge thank you for hosting this talk and also for the organizers of the film festival. I think I'm one of those rare creatures who grew up in Detroit, going to see foreign language film. And I love film, Hong Kong cinema, Wong Kar-wai, Stanley Kwan, Chinese cinema, Zheng Zhenwan. These are just filmmakers that I went out naturally to go see. I think part of the problem is the death of art house cinema, or art house, cinemas that show these films. So that accessibility, I think, is a huge problem. I also think a lack of reflection by American and also British critics about when they label Chinese cinema as propagandistic without actually looking at the fact that a lot of our cinema is as well, and a real denial about that. What I will say, though, is that I agree very much that streaming services, in a way, offer an opportunity, despite the drawback that there is a paywall there. That bars a certain audience from accessing them. But I was thinking something like the Korean series Crash Landing on You. And I just think, this little bitty Korean series that was actually made by both South and North Koreans, looking at both cultures, but doing it in such a humanistic way, I thought was absolutely astonishing. And everyone that I've recommended it to, everyone has watched the entire series. And that just reminded me of the power of culture to build bridges as well. So that's my comment.
Yeah, it's true. I think it's important to look past well, like I keep saying, look past the political element of films and realize that, there is good storytelling happening in a lot of Chinese films, and there are a lot of things to like, and a lot of things that will appeal to everybody. There's a comment from Sunil in the chat. Would you like to speak? Or shall I I'll read out the comment in the chat. Sunil says, it seems like Western film media is only interested in Chinese films that are either big hits and so newsworthy on account of their commercial success at home, or a political angle, as with Wolf Warrior. The films the UK media are interested in are art house directors, as this is generally the form for subtitled non-English language films in the UK. This seems to be the case for non-English films in general. Indian films, for example, are often in the UK box office top 10, but they are largely under the cultural radar, as the press is largely not interested. Diasporic films like Crazy Rich Asians or Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think, are quite different. Yeah, thank you for this comment. It's a good point that sort of foreign language films seem to be lumped into the category of art house films. They're sort of sidelined as like not mainstream films. And even though they're performing really well, maybe in the country they were originally released in or even abroad, they're not present in the media. It's an interesting point. Is there anyone else have any questions? Question from Chairman. What is the new film journalism in your view? I think, do you mean by this, what's the next step in journalism? Like what can change? What's the vision? I think my ideal vision would be journalism that is perhaps a bit more aware of itself and the impact that it's having. I think I suppose it's quite easy for journalists to be detached from the influence they have because they don't have this sort of direct contact with their audience that other creators do, I suppose. But it's I think journalists should be aware of the impact that they have in the real world. And my ideal vision would be where journalists use this influence in a positive way. So use the influence that they have to promote films like Chinese films or just other non-English language films that aren't being given the same platform that English language films have. And also, I suppose, being more critical of English language films and not just praising them without criticism. I think all films should be subject to the same criticism and praise where it's due. Yeah. I don't know if any journalists are in the call, if they want to comment on what their goal is with their journalism. Does anyone? Bev Andrews says, my goal would be to get people to see their common humanity. Yeah, I think that's a good goal. Yeah, to promote the things that are universal about culture, but also, I suppose, to respect the things that are different and appreciate this. Thank you. If there's no other questions, I think we can end the call. But thank you very much for coming along and listening to the presentation. And thank you, Dr. Gutcher, for joining in. Really appreciate your contributions. And yeah, thank you to everybody.
Very good work. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.
Cheerio. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.